For yielding, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman from North Carolina yields. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from West Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to yield 4 minutes to a former member of our Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, now a member of the Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 4 minutes.
Still a member in my heart, Mr. Rahal. I appreciate your courtesy in permitting me to speak on this. I've been listening to the debate on the floor, and I really could not disagree more with the proponents of this legislation. They would seek to overturn a 40-year record of trying to get people to follow the law. Look at the record of what states have done over the course of the last 100 years dealing with water quality. And it isn't that the federal government overreached and the states had done too much. We have the Clean Water Act because the states consistently failed to meet their obligations. Today, there are wide variations around America in terms of how zealously individual states take their responsibility and how they balance. There's tremendous pressure for short-term economic gain at the expense of the environment. In some parts of the country, it doesn't bother them to bulldoze mountaintops into streams. And in fact, EPA has not been vigilant in dealing with that. It's only been recently that we're starting to have people come to grips with this issue. It is important that EPA has the opportunity to withhold, to have some sanction when states don't follow through on their plans. This bill would take away the ability of EPA to have sanctions. It's important that we have a third party to be able to do some mediation when there are differences between states. This is not something that is combined to Pennsylvania or West Virginia or Oregon, because our waterways are interconnected. They transcend boundaries. We need to have the federal government making sure that at a minimum there are reasonable standards that are enforced and that the plans that one administration on a state level commits to are actually followed through. You don't have to spend very much time on Google to find out that there are places around the country right now where local authorities, where state authorities are not meeting the highest standards of water quality. I strongly suggest that this is a step backward. Luckily, it's not going to be enacted into law. The administration would veto it. I can't imagine it gets very far in the other body. Look at, and frankly, looking at the list of the organizations, the list that was cited of the people who support this are not the people who have championed clean water. They're the people that want looser restrictions, that want to be able to pollute more, who want to be able to make their own decisions. But the people who care about fish and wildlife, people who care about environmental protection, people who care about the health and welfare of the American public as their first, they are uniformly opposed to this legislation. Mr. Speaker, this is important business. There are economics involved with protecting the environment. In state after state, there's a lot of money to be made by having healthy hunting and fishing. There is money to be saved by having healthy waterways and healthy communities. And if we don't stop the pollution in the first place, then that puts the burden on local communities to spend more on water quality and water treatment. I strongly suggest my colleagues take a hard look at the history of the last 40 years, look at the uneven application of clean water at the state level, look at how judicious approach on the part of the federal government has helped promote compliance. Even the so-called veto power of EPA has been invoked only 13 times in 38 years. This is a bad bill. It should be rejected.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from West Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from West Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm ready to close as we have no further requests on my side under general debate, so I'll give my closing comments now. How much time do I have left, Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman from West Virginia has 17.5 minutes.
Thank you. This is about the process, as I described in my opening comments, not the policy. This bill is not about whether the members of this body support clean, safe water. We all support clean, safe water. I do not know a single member in this House that wants to turn back the clock on the gains that this nation has made in the last 40 years to clean up our rivers and streams. This bill is about the process and precedent. It is about whether we should be allowing one federal agency to run roughshod over the law, over the states, and over other federal agencies to set policy according to political ideology. And I do not think we should be allowing any agency of our federal government to be run in that manner. If this Congress allows the EPA to push the envelope in circumventing the law, in circumventing public comment and public participation, it lays the legal groundwork for the next administration to do the exact same thing. Maybe under the guise of cleaner air and cleaner water, maybe under the guise of lowering those standards. But the precedent that would be set could be devastating. By not taking action, the Congress is tacitly giving the EPA the authority to do what it deems politically necessary, and that is something that this and every Congress has the responsibility to resist. So this bill, Mr. Chairman, is not about whether any member in this institution supports the ends that the EPA is trying to reach. It is about whether or not we believe that we should be allowed to use any means to reach those ends, and I do not believe they should. There are plenty of members on this floor today who believe that the intentions of the EPA with respect to its mission to ensure clean water are noble. I put myself in that category. But we all have to worry when an agency goes to such lengths to circumvent the Congress and rulemaking process so as to impose its own agenda. Because after the next election, or the election after that, or the election after that, some future EPA may not have such noble intentions. And if we fail to stand up today, we will suffer the consequences of our inaction later. This bill is about transparency. It does not tell the EPA they cannot effect improvements in water quality. It says that they cannot do it without letting the people have a voice in the process. That's the way the rulemaking process is intended to work, but this EPA has effectively thwarted that process and thumbed its nose at the people by issuing guidance and treating it like regulation. As I said in my opening comments, I wish we were not here on this bill today. I wish it would not be necessary. And I would much rather see a cooperative federal relationship among the agencies and the agencies, federal agencies with the states and with the industries involved. But that has not occurred, and therefore it has created an era of mistrust, distrust, bitterness, and an outright scared attitude among our coal miners, whether or not they will have a job next year or even tomorrow, and for how long their current job will last. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I do conclude by speaking in support of this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. Ray Hall, yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have?
The gentleman from Ohio has 12 minutes remaining.
Okay. Thank you. You know, I think what this bill is addressing, we have 21st century problems and challenges, and we're looking for 21st century solutions. And I want to lay out the facts here a little bit to be a little more clarity, and I appreciate my colleague from West Virginia for his support of the bill. But, you know, we have to realize that the state EPAs have to have an approved plan by the federal EPA. And that's a framework they're working under. And you just can't have the federal EPA coming in during the ball game and trying to change the rules and undermining the efforts of the state EPAs. Now I want to comment from the gentleman from Oregon's comments about, we're going to go backwards, and we've made progress in the last 40 years, and the states didn't do anything in the last 40 years or before. Let's remember what happened prior to 1972. I grew up 12 miles from the city of Cleveland, the Cuyahoga River. I remember when the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. I remember as a child when I couldn't go down and swim in Lake Erie anymore because raw sewage was going into Lake Erie. Those events caused this Congress to pass the Clean Water Act and establish the U.S. EPA, and also give authority for the states to set up their programs. Prior to that, nobody was concerned about the environment, and we didn't have what I call the so-called environmental movement, where we're all concerned about having clean water. Since then, we've made tremendous progress. On point source pollution, we've made tremendous progress in discharges. We don't have the discharges going in to our lakes and rivers and streams like we did 40 years ago. We've made significant progress addressing non-point source pollution, and not to say we don't have more challenges, but I want to talk about, when we talk about one size fits all. And the U.S. EPA has an agenda right now that's overreaching, and they want to set policies and parameters that fits for everybody to work under. And I'll give you an example. The numerical nutrient standard. Let's take phosphorus and nitrogen. You hear a lot about phosphorus sediment pollution and in our lakes and rivers and streams. And to go in there and set a number, a numerical number that they can't exceed that and discharge at that level, causes some problems. For the last 40 years, we've been operating under a system called the narrative standard, where states can go in there and look at what's going on in that watershed and that stream or that river and determine, because I can tell you, in every river and stream in this country, there's different things happening. The biology is different, the pH is different, the water temperature, the water flow, sunlight, a whole host of things, and they can incorporate that and come up with a plan how to address the issue they have in their local locale. When you set a number at such a high level, it puts the states at a problem where they can't meet an attainment, or it's not possible. And we've seen that happen in Florida, and now that's why Florida, there's litigation pending, because they've set a one-size-fits-all, where Florida, ironically, was moving to the point to set a numerical standard, but they wanted to also address and incorporate what I call the narrative standard, so they could address what was happening in each locale and not a huge region, to address those differences that are happening in that stream or that river. So one-size-fits-all doesn't work, and it causes problems, and that will make us go back where we were, the progress we've made in the last 40 years. Now I want to also address in this bill, we talk about the permitting issue. One of the most egregious things I've seen since I've been in Congress since January was a revocation of a permit. Yes, it was in West Virginia. It was a coal mine operation that went through 10 years, an environmental impact study, got their permit in 07, and then 3 years later the permit was revoked. Not because they were in permit violation. The Army Corps of Engineers testified in my committee that there was no problems. The state of West Virginia EPA did not support revoking that permit. I really don't know why they revoked that permit, other than maybe it was an agenda of somebody's. But they were not in violation of the permit. It's one thing to revoke a permit when you're in violation of the permit, but when you're not in violation of the permit, to take that permit away, it sets a very dangerous precedent, because the dangerous precedent it sets across our entire economy. If you're an entity or an enterprise and you have to have a permit to be in business from the federal government, and that federal government, at the whim of some bureaucrat or the administration, come in and pull that permit any time they want to, who's going to take risk capital and make that investment, create jobs, knowing that they could be shut down tomorrow because their permit's not there so they can stay in business? And that's what this bill addresses. They have to get concurrence. The U.S. EPA would have to get concurrence from the state EPA to support that revocation of that permit, to shut that, in this case, to shut that industry, that business down. So this is really a jobs bill. We're trying to relieve uncertainty and people know what the playing field is, and I can tell you, I think the state EPAs can do a better job in their locales, because they know what's going on there, than have a one-size-fits-all policy by the federal government and an overreaching and burdensome regulatory climate that kills jobs, kills economic investment, and, like I say again, kills jobs. And so that's why it's important, I think, to move this bill forward. This is a jobs bill. We've sent several bills over to the Senate that are jobs bills, and I urge the Senate to take them up because we've got unemployment at 9.2% and rising, and I think it's important that people have an opportunity to have a job and economic opportunities, and we need, it's the federal government to create the environment for our, what I call the job creators to have that confidence to make those investments and start hiring people back and growing their businesses. And this bill is really important for the, to encourage cooperative arrangements and working from the federal EPA and the state EPAs. And I was just really floored in the committee hearings we had where we had state EPAs come in, and some of them were from the other side of the aisle from me, testified against the U.S. EPA and their actions and their overreach. And, you know, a strong economy, some people don't understand this. I say this a lot. A strong and growing economy will provide the resources to have, to protect, to invest, to protect and enhance the environment. An economy that's struggling right now, it makes it tougher to have those resources. And if you think of an example, you look at some third world countries where their biggest challenge is feeding their people. They don't have the resources to build sewage treatment plants and water filtration systems and do other things to protect the environment. We have the resources, we have a strong growing economy, and we should be working with those businesses because most businesses and most people want to do the right thing. Everybody wants clean water and clean air. And so I take exceptions from the comments from my colleague from Oregon that says that we're not protecting the environment. I think a strong growing economy does protect the environment, and I think the regulatory policies are in place at the state levels because the states are set up to do it now, different than 40 years ago, to regulate and also enforce environmental protection laws, if it's mountaintop mining or what it is. We have the rules in place. In Ohio, when I was in the state Senate 2 years ago, we passed comprehensive legislation to add additional regulation on the oil and gas industry to protect our water ground, our aquifer, our water aquifers, and our surface water. And we did, and I'm really encouraged now the potential we have with the Utica Shale, the Marcellus Shale, to make us closer to being energy independent and not dependent on and shipping almost $1 trillion a year away to other countries and some of those that don't really like us too much. We've got that opportunity to have a strong growing economy and provide the energy, but also protect the environment at the same time. And we just have the regulatory process in place, and I think this enables a stronger regulatory process because it emboldens the state EPAs to do their job and work cooperatively with their partners in Washington, D.C. So I thank you for the time.
Gentleman from Ohio
My time.
yields back the balance of his time. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the amendment in the nature of a substitute printed in the bill shall be considered as an original bill for the purpose of amendment under the 5-minute rule and shall be considered read. No amendment to the committee amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be in order except those printed in House Report 112-144. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report by a member designated in the report, shall be considered read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to an amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 1, printed in House Report 112-144. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment I could add, my amendment number 7.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in House Report number 112-144, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Pursuant to the House Resolution 347, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Let me thank the chairman very much, and I definitely support cooperation between the federal government and the state government. That is absolutely the best partnership and one that I encourage. Having been a member of the local city council of my own city of Houston, I also know that unfunded mandates are very much difficult to overcome. But I argue vigorously against the underlying legislation because it does equate to undermining the health of Americans. We need clean water, not dirty water. And so this amendment strikes the entire legislation that causes us to ignore a partnership that has been established between the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, which is a state system. And to my count, some 47 states have initially got into the system and have worked to ensure that they have clean water. Why do I suggest that this is a very challenging approach to take that the underlying legislation has? Because it prevents the EPA from taking actions to revise outdated state water quality standards. It makes a state the final arbiter of whether an NPDES permit, a license for better water quality, is in fact to be implemented so that one state may do something that impacts negatively on another state. These are the people we're concerned about, a working nurse and a healthy baby. Or we are concerned about a gentleman by the name of Mr. Calaccio, who is a resident of Crestwood, who indicated some years ago that he was worried about the water he drank for years without knowing what it was contaminated with. Cancer study triggers fears in Crestwood, which I'd like to, at the appropriate time, submit into the record. His final sentence said, "I can't help but wonder if what happened to me had something to do with the water." My amendment is straightforward. It strikes the language of this bill. It says, let's go back to the drawing table. I want to be able to help members, but if you have 47 states who have been engaged in this process, let's find a way that we can come together and have clean water and not dirty water. This is a straightforward amendment that says that this is overreaching. The EPA would be prohibited from resolving conflicting state decisions on protecting water quality. Join me in supporting the Jackson Lee amendment. I reserve my time.
The gentlewoman reserves her time. What purpose does the gentleman from Ohio rise?
I wish to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The intent of H.R. 2018 is to restore the balance between the states and the federal government in carrying out the Clean Water Act. This amendment simply strikes the entire bill, as she stated, and ensures that the EPA can continue to unilaterally force its own one-size-fits-all federal policies onto the state's water quality programs, which, by the way, they previously already approved. Under this amendment, EPA will continue to pass unfunded mandates onto the states, ensures that the EPA issues interim guidance that frustrates states and permit applicants, and ensures that the EPA will continue their legally dubious activities of revoking already legally issued permits, as I stated earlier. I urge members to oppose this amendment, and I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, is recognized.
I thank the good intentions of the gentleman, and I am concerned of the interpretation. Let me just share with you very briefly my own state. In my own state, I'm aware of how tributaries can impact the body of water they flow into. Currently, there is a dead zone, an area of low oxygen where marine life cannot survive in the Gulf of Mexico. This dead zone, estimated to reach 9,421 square miles, is due to increased levels of nitrogen and phosphorus that wash into the Gulf from the Mississippi River and other tributaries. This legislation prevents the EPA from regulating criteria for pollutants that cause dead zones. We are the protectors of America's assets, its waterways, its drinking water, its ability to have opportunity for clean water for our fish and fishing. I ask you to let's go back to the drawing boards. If we have states that are already participating, let's demand in an administrative process for EPA to restrain itself, but let's not take away the underlying power that is going to allow us to have clean drinking water and someone who lives in Crestwood to be able to be possibly cancer-free. I ask my colleagues to support this amendment. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back her time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman from Ohio.
I ask for a recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in House Report 112-144. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in House Report number 112-144, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 347, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, is recognized.
I thank the distinguished chairman, and again, I thank my friends on the floor of the House. I did not acknowledge my friend, the ranking member. And I offer myself as a person who seeks to collaborate and fix problems. And so my second amendment says let's work together, but there's sometimes the heart of a matter that has to be addressed. My amendment strikes the language that really is the heart of the matter. It strikes the language in the bill ensuring that the vital role played by the EPA in determining whether or not certain pollutants enter our waterways can still exist. Provides states with nearly unlimited authority to determine which pollutants can enter our waterways, does not take into account issues that arise when states disagree. My amendment strikes the language that allows states, 50 states, to conflict against each other and one-upsmanship. I'm going to do this. No, you're going to do this. This standardizes the issue of clean water. This stands up for people like those in Crestwood in Illinois that wonder whether the water caused cancer, kidney cancer, in a 30-year-old. With that, I reserve my time.
The gentlewoman reserves the balance of her time. The gentleman from Ohio.
I wish to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. By striking Section 2 of the bill, this amendment would effectively gut much of the bill. Section 2 of the bill would limit EPA from unilaterally changing approved state water quality standards and permitting decisions, or from withdrawing approval of a state water quality permitting program or limiting federal financial assistance for the state water quality permitting program on the basis that the EPA disagrees with the state regarding a state water quality standard that EPA has approved. By striking Section 2 of the bill, this amendment would continue to allow this administration's EPA to impose a one-size-fits-all federal policies on the state's water quality programs. We are not in favor of the EPA continuing their regulatory onslaught on the states. I urge all members to oppose this amendment. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from New York.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentlelady from Texas for yielding, and I also thank her for offering this amendment, and I rise in support of the amendment. The amendment would strike the provisions of the underlying bill that threaten existing Clean Water Act authority related to the discharge of pollutants under the Act. I oppose these provisions in the underlying bill, and I view this amendment as an effort to improve an otherwise very bad bill, and on that basis I support the amendment. I yield back the balance of my time with my thanks to the gentlelady from Texas.
I thank the gentleman.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentlewoman is recognized.
Is it my right to close, Mr. Chairman, or?
The gentleman from Ohio has the right to close.
Let me refer my colleagues again to basic facts. 47 states have entered into agreements with the EPA because they've decided, in spite of the challenges that we all have on making sure that we do the right thing, that it is the right thing to do, that clean water is a priority. And I would offer as a viable picture and a recollection of Americans who had to live through histories when water was not clean. We did have that era in our lifetime, or at least in the lifetimes of many. I would argue that that is not the life we would like to go back to. And this particular section is protecting us against pollutants that degrade surface water, rendering it unsafe for drinking, fishing, swimming, and other activities coming from vast variety of chemicals, industry, and other sources. By regulating the sources that dispense these harmful pollutants, the EPA is able to ensure that all states have access to safe drinking water. You want a jobs bill? Then you create the companies that are going to help us keep our waterways clean. Put people to work cleaning water. Put people to work complying with the right thing to do to ensure that we have clean drinking water, and babies and working moms and families can turn on that faucet and ensure that they can drink that clean water. We want to work with industry. We want to be able to come halfway, but we don't want to return America to a time when you would dip down and you find in developing nations the enormous amount of diseases that children have because they do not have clean water. Go to some of our developing nations, see what they're washing themselves in, see what they're drinking. That's not America. We have the opportunity to be the kind of nation that works with our businesses but also fights for our children and provides the opportunity for clean water. I ask my colleagues to stand with us and strike Section 2 to allow us, one, to go for a compromise if we can, but also to stand for those who would welcome clean water. Let's end diseases that can be caused in this reckless manner. I ask my colleagues to support the Jackson-Lee Amendment to support clean water in America. With that, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Emphasize and restate that the states are operating under a already approved plan from the U.S. EPA to how to address these concerns. And so I don't see how we go backwards because they're operating within that framework that was set up. And by the way, under the Clean Water Act and pollutants, that plan is reviewed every 3 years. So I yield my time.
The gentleman from Ohio yields back his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson-Lee. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson-Lee, will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in House Report 112-144. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from West Virginia rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 3, printed in House Report Number 112-144, offered by Mrs. Capito of West Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 347, the gentlewoman from West Virginia, Ms. Capito, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from West Virginia.
I'd like to thank the chairman of my subcommittee, Mr. Gibbs, for his leadership on this issue. My amendment is a simple reaction to conversations that I've had with the administrator and others at the EPA, and also the President of the United States. In questioning the President, I said, Mr. President, when you're going forth on your rules and regulations at the EPA, do you consider job and economic impact? And he said, we should. And I say we should, and that's the purpose of my amendment. This requires the EPA to analyze the impact on jobs and economic impact prior to issuing a regulation, policy statement, guidance, or implementing any new or substantially altered program under the Clean Water Act. Earlier this year, the EPA retroactively vetoed a previously approved Clean Water Act permit in West Virginia at the Spruce Mine. This came as quite a surprise and was very unprecedented because I don't believe the EPA, if it has, it's been maybe once or twice in its history, ever retroactively vetoed a permit. And it was a very chilling effect not only on jobs but on the economic activity in our state. This action has caused a slow bleed of jobs throughout Appalachia. Reaching back to revoke a permit is particularly concerning because it causes great uncertainty for job creators in our state. This is at a time when we have, as a nation, 9.2% unemployment. We need to get people to work. Why would a company invest in a new project when they would think that that would be permitted, and to think that there would be a reach back by the EPA under the Clean Water Act where they could revoke this permit. To me, this just chills job creation in our state. The EPA's ideological war on our energy producers is manifesting itself in other ways in my district and across the country. In the eastern part of West Virginia, the EPA, listen to this, is using aerial surveillance of family farms with the goal of ensuring compliance to the Clean Water Act. According to an article in a local newspaper, the EPA is going so far as to regulate the type of sheds the family farmers can have for their cattle operations. But when asked about the economic impact of this kind of regulatory overreach, the EPA's representative made it clear that jobs are irrelevant. As the nation faces 9.2 unemployment and hundreds of thousands of jobs hang in limbo, the administration has refused to reconsider this agenda. The negative impact on the regulatory actions upon jobs is obvious. However, the EPA has been unable to give me a straight answer on whether it does or does not consider the negative impact on jobs or economic impact. So let's put it clearly in the law. You must consider this to strike that balance between environment and economy. All this amendment is asking for, quite simply, is transparency. It doesn't mandate what a decision has to be made, considering what jobs or economic impact is discovered. It does say that when jobs and economic impact are negative, the EPA has to go to the local governance authority, whether it's the governor or the smaller community, and explain this action. So it's transparency, and it also, I think, will help further clarify decisions, but also help our energy producers figure out how to weave the balance between the economy and the environment. In closing, I've heard a lot of talk about our collective goal of clean air and clean water. We all share that. And no one more than everyone on the floor sitting here today and those of us across the country. But we cannot afford this continued assault, unaccountable, untransparent assault on our American jobs. So thank you. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from West Virginia reserves her time. What purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
Claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much. Let me start. We have heard a great deal about how reversals on the part of the EPA have caused uncertainty in the business community, uncertainty that leads to job loss, uncertainty that leads to a lack of interest in investing. Here are the numbers. In 40 years, the EPA has reversed 13 permits, 13 out of over 2 million issued. That is a veto rate of 0.00065%. I fail to see how a reversal rate of significantly less than 1% can create the kind of uncertainty that we hear about from our colleagues. In fact, that kind of reversal rate encourages a reliance on the legitimacy and the validity of a permit granted, not the questioning of it. I would also point out that of these 13 reversals, 7 took place under the administration of President Reagan, 4 took place under the presidency of George Bush, the first George Bush, 1 under George W. Bush, and 1 under President Obama. I think we are hard-pressed to develop a fact-based argument that there is an assault or that there is an overreach on the EPA, on the part of the EPA. Now, with respect to the subject of the amendment itself, the EPA has testified before the Water Resources and Environment Subcommittee that it already considers the implications of its actions on jobs and on the economy. In fact, many of the requirements that brings the EPA to do that were enacted by the Republican majority when they last controlled the House. And as a result, I would suggest that enactment of this amendment will only duplicate the analysis that the EPA is already undertaking. As a result, I fear that this amendment will only increase the opportunity for litigation relating to actions on the part of the EPA, causing a new cause of action in the Clean Water Act for third-party lawsuits. If anything, I fear that the effect of this amendment would be to tie up efforts by the EPA to protect public health and the environment in a bureaucratic morass. On that basis, I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves his time. The gentleman from gentlewoman from West Virginia is recognized.
I'd just like to quickly respond in terms of the revocation of the one permit. Let's talk about the hundreds of permits that are sitting at the EPA trying to figure out how to meet the balance here. Let's look at the total picture, that's all I'm saying, of jobs and environment. I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Ohio.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I urge the members to support this Ms. Capito's amendment. Her amendment would bring transparency to the development of regulations and require the EPA to provide a more robust analysis of the economic impacts of its regulatory actions. This will not halt the issuance of regulations, only provide better information to those who are responsible for writing the regulations, in this case the EPA. I think we can all agree the EPA could have better information to utilize to make better regulatory decisions, and I am concerned because I believe the administrator of the U.S. EPA has testified that their main concern when they look at a regulatory issue is public health and safety and environment, and they don't do any cost-benefit analysis and diminishing returns and all that. So I urge support of the amendment.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentlewoman from West Virginia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
May I inquire as to how much time I have left?
The gentleman from New York has 2.5 minutes.
I yield 2 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Rahal.
I thank the gentleman from New York for yielding. I rise in support of the gentlelady from West Virginia's amendment. Let me state that at the very beginning. My only concerns here were attaching an economic analysis amendment to the pending legislation, which is directed at the Clean Water Act interpretations. The pending amendment by the gentlelady from West Virginia, which, as I say, I support, would appear to me to more broaden the direction in which this bill goes, which I think detracts from the original intent of the legislation to zero in on Clean Water Act issues. The gentlelady's amendment should properly, I believe it is, subject of another standalone bill that's been introduced in this body to judge economic analysis. That legislation I support as well. I might add, in addition, that I brought this issue up with Cass Susteen, who is the head of the White House Office of Regulatory Review, whose job it is to determine and to examine the economic analysis of regulations that come out of the federal agencies. That's the White House Office of Regulatory Review's jurisdiction, not EPA's jurisdiction, as the gentlelady has paraphrased the EPA administrator, and as we've all heard her say, that job repercussions is not necessarily part of her job description. The unfortunate fact is that the Office of Regulatory Review under the White House jurisdiction has very limited staff and does not have the staff availability to examine the economic analysis of every regulation that comes out of every agency of our federal government, to which they are tasked to do, but certainly don't have the resources to fully do their job. So the bottom line, I do support the gentlelady's amendment. I do worry that it overly broadens this particular piece of legislation and should be properly, as it is, the subject of a separate standalone legislation on its own. I yield back.
Gentleman from West Virginia yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentlewoman from West Virginia has 15 seconds and is recognized.
Well, I want to thank my colleague from West Virginia for his support, because he and I are seeing firsthand we want to see transparency. We want to see the information move forward on the economic impact. We're at a place where we need jobs, we want jobs, we just want to see the facts. I yield back, and I urge support of my amendment.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. For the reasons I've cited, I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from West Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, go ahead.
The gentleman from New
Mr.
York.
Chairman, on that I request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from West Virginia will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 4, printed in House Report 112-144. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Hawaii seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I seek recognition to speak in support of my amendment that is before you.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in House Report number 112-144, offered by Ms. Hanabusa of Hawaii.
Pursuant to House Resolution 347, the gentlewoman from Hawaii, Ms. Hanabusa, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Hawaii.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. This amendment simply seeks from the administrator of the EPA to submit to Congress within 1 year and then annually thereafter a report on any increase in waterborne pathogenic microorganisms, which includes protozoas, viruses, bacteria, and parasites, toxic chemicals or toxic metals such as lead and mercury, in waters regulated by the state under the provisions of H.R. 2018, including any further amendments to this bill. Mr. Chair, there is nothing as important to all of us, especially for those of us in Hawaii, as water quality. We are the only island state, and of course, our pristine waters are very critical to us for our major economic engine, which is tourism. And I don't believe it's any different for any other state, especially those of us who have bordering oceans and even those which may have navigable streams within our borders. Water is critical. 2018, what it does is it simply states that the states now have the right to regulate water quality. By doing that, however, we need to know what they're doing and to ensure for all of us and our constituents that the states are doing a good job. All this amendment is seeking from the states is for the EPA to report to us so we can know if in fact they're doing what this bill gives them the authority to do, which is to make the decisions regarding water quality. For that reason, Mr. Chair, I ask for the support of this amendment. And
Does the gentlewoman reserve?
I reserve.
Gentleman from Ohio, what purpose does he rise?
I wish to claim time for opposition.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Anabasu Amendment authorizes the EPA to study the effectiveness of cooperative federalism once H.R. 2018 is enacted. While the amendment seems to carry a bias in that the EPA can only report an increase of pathogens or toxins and not reductions after enactment of H.R. 2018, the EPA will have very little to report upon. H.R. 2018 will lead to a better water quality decisions made at the local level, and this will benefit the environment for all of us. H.R. 2018 will lead to H.R. 2018 would lead to water quality degradation. None of us in this chamber would support it if that was the case. Noting the bias of this amendment, if the sponsor would like to ask for unanimous consent request to modify her amendment, to modify the line 5 after increase by adding the phrase or reductions, we then would be able to accept the amendment. I balance my time.
Gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentlewoman from Hawaii is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I would accept the amendment. However, I would also like to present Mr. Bishop with 1 minute of my time.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, and I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and I thank her for offering this amendment. I just want to simply say, as I've made clear, I do not support the underlying legislation, but this is a very prudent amendment that allows us to assess as we go forward whether or not this law is proposed law is in the best interest of our nation's clean water and in the interest of our nation's health. So I commend the gentlelady for offering the amendment, and I'm very happy to hear that this may be accepted. So thank you very much. I yield back the balance.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Hawaii reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
I continue to reserve, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentlewoman from Hawaii is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I believe with our unanimous consent to the amendment that they will accept the amendment with that amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Does the gentlewoman reserve or yield back?
I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
I think we're having a little parliamentary procedure here, Mr. Chairman. I do think the amendment will be in order in just shortly. I think that it is a good amendment, and I want to commend my colleague for offering it, because I think we'll get an accurate report from the EPA when they do their study that we're making progress because of 2018 or if we're going backwards. So I think it's important to have this amendment amended to provide those words or reductions. And I yield my reserved time.
Gentleman yields back. What purpose does the gentlewoman from Hawaii rise?
Mr. Chair, it's a procedural issue. I ask for unanimous consent to accept the amendment.
The clerk will report the modification.
Modification to Amendment Number 4 by Ms. Hanabusa on line 5, insert or reduction after increase.
Is there objection to the modification? No. Without objection, so ordered. The question is on the amendment as modified, offered by the gentlewoman from Hawaii. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 5, printed in House Report 112-144. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado rise? Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 5, printed in House Report Number 112-144, offered by Mr. Polis of Colorado.
Pursuant to House Resolution 347, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our country's worst polluters don't deserve a get-out-of-jail-free card. I think that's an unintended consequence of the current language of the bill, absent this amendment, and I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to adopt this amendment. Regardless of one's position on the underlying bill, one thing I hope we can all agree on is that the most egregious polluters, these are polluters that Republican and Democratic state administrations, Republican and Democratic experts agree are the most egregious polluters, those who simply disregard the law knowingly, those who repeatedly ignore state regulation, are bad actors, and they should not be among those who benefit from this bill. The states deserve to have the EPA back them up and help them keep tabs on these polluters who continually violate state rules. Unfortunately, the vast majority of these polluters have escaped not only punishment but simply increased scrutiny. Polluters that continually violate the law are classified as significant noncompliance. That's the term that's used. This classification simply puts these polluters under a greater microscope by EPA. It doesn't change authorities. It doesn't engender some new regulatory scheme. It simply ensures that the EPA is keeping a close eye on them and ensuring that state programs are being followed. Again, I believe it's a piece of this that's outside of this larger state versus federal debate. It's one that's consistent with supporting states' regulation of the most egregious infractors. States simply don't have the resources to keep our water safe on their own. According to a 2009 New York Times investigation, state officials attributed rising pollution rates to increased workloads and dwindling resources. In 46 states, local regulators already have primary responsibility for crucial aspects of the Clean Water Act. The job needed to protect our health is simply too big for state regulators alone. An example of significant noncompliance from the Bush administration in 2001 and 2006. The Bush administration found that Macy Energy, the same company responsible for the Big Branch mine disaster, had accrued over 2,000 significant violations, and the state didn't have the resources to hold them accountable. Under significant noncompliance, the Bush administration was able to more closely watch Macy and ensure they followed state rule. Again, in its current form, this bill offers these most extreme polluters a get-out-of-jail-free card, unraveling EPA's long history of backing up state authority and successfully and reasonably keeping major polluters in check. My amendment very simply states that the EPA can keep a closer eye, that's all, closer eye, on the most extreme violators of the law, polluters who are habitually out of compliance in significant noncompliance. Without my amendment, this bill would mean that our nation's worst offenders would be free from EPA scrutiny, with sole authority being new, less organized, and naive state programs ripe for loopholes, and some of which simply don't have the scale to adequately regulate what's at stake. Mr. Speaker, if a student is disruptive in class, it's only common sense they go to the principal's office. That doesn't mean the teacher doesn't have autonomy in the class or the troubled student doesn't respect the teacher. They need to know there's greater consequences for bad behavior. I'd like to reserve the balance of my time.
Colorado reserves his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Ohio rise?
Mr. Chairman, I wish to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Polaris seems to suggest that states would continue to allow polluters to pollute waters of their states under H.R. 2018 unless this amendment is adopted. Nothing could be further from the truth. If H.R. 2018 degraded water quality, none of us would support this legislation. I also question the implementation of the amendment. If you had a permit holder who is in significant noncompliance, does that negate water quality provisions for the water body the permit holder may be polluting? Of course not. Nothing in H.R. 2018 allows a permit holder to violate the terms of a permit. I urge all members to oppose the Pelosi amendment. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis, is recognized.
A question as to how much time remains on both sides?
The gentleman has 2 minutes.
I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Bishop.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank the gentleman for offering this, I think, very well thought out and well conceived amendment. I support the amendment offered by the gentleman because it suggests that the most appropriate place for retaining federal oversight is against polluters who have a track record on the most serious violations of the Clean Water Act, those found to be in significant noncompliance, and thus the retention of a federal oversight role, I think, is very wise. And let me just amplify that. In September of 2009, the New York Times ran a front-page story highlighting from 2004 to 2008, 506,000 violations of the Clean Water Act were reported for both major and minor facilities, and during that time the states only took 11,000 enforcement actions, so basically a 2% enforcement rate. We need to have the federal government retain its oversight role. This amendment would do that. I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Colorado reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
I just want to reemphasize that if there's a permit holder in violation, the states have an obligation and responsibility to step in and take action and enforcement. If they probably didn't, I'm sure that there's some organization that would file a lawsuit against that EPA. So I don't think this amendment does anything to help the bill. I think the bill takes care of it, and the people would be in violation, would be prosecuted under the law. I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Ohio yields back his time. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't agree, as the gentleman from Ohio said. I don't believe that this should be yet another unfunded mandate on the states. While the number of regulated facilities has more than doubled in the last decade, many state enforcement budgets have been flat when adjusted for inflation. In New York, for example, the number of regulated polluters has almost doubled in the last decade, but the number of inspections have remained the same. Again, my amendment gives the state the ability to send habitual bad actors to the EPA, not for worse punishment, not for some change in authority, not for some overreach, simply for closer scrutiny. My amendment does not affect punishments. It simply allows EPA to keep a close eye on the frequent violator in support of the state, as is the practice with significant noncompliance. I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this amendment to ensure that the worst violators are properly inspected in support of state regulation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
All time having expired, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Gentleman from Ohio.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 6, printed in House Report 112-144. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk and ask for its
consideration. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 6, printed in House Report Number 112-144, offered by Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 347, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be remiss if I failed to note the irony of the legislation before us today. After 7 months of ranting and raving about the lack of regulatory certainty, which causes economic stagnation, the Republican majority is now attempting to pass a bill which will replace a clear, predictable national clean water standard with an utterly unpredictable patchwork of state standards. Chaos does not federalism make, nor is one state's ability to sully a downstream state's waters consistent with the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution. This legislation, with the Orwellian title, Clean Water Cooperative Federalism Act, would endanger watersheds all across America, including the precious Chesapeake Bay in our region here in the National Capital Region. As my colleagues are aware, the Bay watershed encompasses 6 states and the District of Columbia. Logically, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Agriculture, the National Geographic and Atmospheric Administration, the U.S. Geological Survey, and other agencies work in tandem with states throughout the watershed to reduce pollution entering the Bay. Since watersheds do not correspond easily to state lines, this kind of interagency cooperation is essential and efficient to restore America's largest estuary. H.R. 2018 would unravel that partnership, balkanizing water policy and undermining Bay restoration. I've drafted a simple amendment, Mr. Chairman, to exempt watersheds like the Chesapeake Bay from this bill by limiting the bill's jurisdiction to watersheds which do not receive federal aid for watershed restoration and related activities. This amendment would allow critical efforts such as the restoration of the Bay, Long Island Sound, the Great Lakes, Puget Sound, Gulf of Mexico, and San Francisco Bay and other great waters to continue. It would acknowledge the undeniable fact that water does not stop when it reaches the state line. This amendment is important because these great waters are an integral part of our American heritage. The Chesapeake Bay was where John Smith arrived and founded Jamestown. The first colonial exploration of Virginia, also by John Smith, used the bay to explore the rivers of Virginia and Maryland. The Chesapeake is home to the French blockade of the British Navy, which enabled George Washington to have victory at Yorktown, and a successful conclusion to the Revolutionary War. For 200 years, the Chesapeake Bay was one of America's most productive fisheries, fueling the growth of coastal communities such as Alexandria, Norfolk, and Baltimore, as well as an indigenous fleet of boats, skipjacks, dead rises, and bug-eyes. Unfortunately, development and overfishing wiped out many of the fisheries that were once so productive. When John Smith arrived in the bay, his crew had neglected to bring fishing line, but they were able to pull fish out of the bay by scooping them out of the water. Smith wrote that the oysters in the bay floor lay thick as stones and were so prolific that these filter feeders cleaned the entire volume of the bay daily. The shad runs up the James, Rappahannock, and Potomac rivers were so immense that colonial observers noted it would have been possible to walk all the way from the James, from Richmond, to Manchester on the backs of fish without ever touching water. These fish were so large and powerful that when caught, they actually shook the first Manchester Bridge on its piers. Of course, the bay is part of a much larger watershed now that is as historic ecologically as the bay is itself. To restore this great water body, many federal agencies have been working in partnership with states, localities, and landowners. As written, H.R. 2018 would rupture that partnership, effectively giving any one state veto authority over the region's restoration efforts. My simple amendment would protect our ability to keep working together as a region to restore the bay. This regional effort was first started at the federal level by a Republican, my old friend, Republican U.S. Senator Charles McMathias of Maryland. To the extent we're making progress today, it's a result of the partnership between Virginia, whose General Assembly is investing over $100 million annually in private land conservation, a Republican-led initiative that was expanded under a Democratic governor. Let us not turn our backs on this 30-year partnership. I ask for your support for this common-sense amendment to continue the improvements to America's largest and most historic estuary, as well as our nation's other great waters. I reserve